4 Apache virgins knelt in a perfect silent line before his cabin, not in prayer, but as a delegation delivering an ultimatum to God himself. Dr. Elias Thorne wasn't a prophet. He was a man of science who had fled to the frontier to escape the ghosts of a world he could no longer heal. He had come for silence, not for a sacrifice. He was about to order them away when the eldest of the 4, a girl with eyes as old as the mountains, opened her hands. She held no weapon, only a small blood-stained piece of linen, the unmistakable sign of the lung fever he knew was consuming their mother. To accept their terrible, impossible bargain was to violate every oath he had ever taken. To refuse was to condemn a woman he could save to a slow, agonizing death. The choice wasn't between right and wrong anymore. It was between his own damnation and hers. 4 Apache virgins knelt in a perfect silent line before his cabin, not in prayer, but as a delegation delivering an ultimatum to God himself. Dr. Elias Thorne wasn't a prophet. He was a man of science who had fled to the frontier to escape the ghosts of a world he could no longer heal. He had come for silence, not for a sacrifice. He was about to order them away when the eldest of the 4, a girl with eyes as old as the mountains, opened her hands. She held no weapon, only a small blood-stained piece of linen, the unmistakable sign of the lung fever he knew was consuming their mother. To accept their terrible, impossible bargain was to violate every oath he had ever taken. To refuse was to condemn a woman he could save to a slow, agonizing death. The choice wasn't between right and wrong anymore. It was between his own damnation and hers. The linen lay in her palm, a crimson stain blooming on the white fabric like a poppy in a field of snow. For a moment, the world dissolved into the scent of carbolic soap and the sharp metallic tang of blood. He wasn't in the raw wilderness of the Arizona Territory anymore. He was back in Philadelphia, in a room sealed against the miasma of the city, the air thick with the useless smoke of eucalyptus. He could hear the shallow, rattling breaths from the small bed, see the pale blue lips of his son. The memory was a physical thing, a phantom scalpel twisting in his gut. "No," Elias said. The word was a shard of glass. He saw the eldest girl, Nita. He would later learn she was called flinch, not at the sound, but at the finality in it. Her sisters remained motionless, carved from the same stone of desperation. "I am a doctor, not a purveyor. Take your offer elsewhere." He did not wait for a reply. He stepped back inside his cabin, the door closing with a solid, definitive thud that echoed the closing of a tomb. His world was one of order. Scalpels and forceps lay on a clean linen cloth, arranged by size. Bottles of iodine and laudanum stood in militant rows on a crude shelf. This sterile fortress was all he had left, a meticulously constructed defense against the chaos that had consumed his life. He could feel their presence outside, a silent weight against the door. He gripped the edge of his examination table, his knuckles white, and fought the urge to look through the window. To see their faces would be to see the faces of the ghosts he'd crossed a continent to escape. He heard no pleading, no angry shouts, only the whisper of the wind through the pines, and then, after an eternity, the soft crunch of moccasins on gravel, fading into silence. They were gone. He had won. He had maintained the sterile perimeter of his isolation. A wave of relief washed over him, so cold and hollow it felt like drowning. He had done the right thing, the only thing he could do. He had refused to fail again. That night, the sky broke. Rain lashed against the cabin in furious sheets, and the wind howled like a grieving animal. Each gust of wind seemed to whisper a name he had forbidden himself to speak. Anna. The thunder was a deep, rattling cough that shook the very foundations of the cabin. Elias lit a lamp, the steady flame a small point of logic in the roaring chaos, but it offered no comfort. He saw his reflection in the dark window pane, a haunted, hollowed-out man clinging to the wreckage of his principles. He paced the confines of the small room, a caged animal. He had made the logical choice. He was one man. He could not take responsibility for the health of an entire tribe, not for a price that would shatter what was left of his soul. It was a sound argument, a rational position, but it offered no defense against the memory that the storm had clawed open. His wife, her face pale and etched with a terror that had transcended grief, gripping his arm. Her voice, not a shout, but a raw, broken whisper that had scraped him hollow. "Do something, Elias. For God's sake, do something." The rain hammered the roof. The wind shrieked. He had done nothing then. He had stood with all his knowledge, all his science, and done nothing but watch the fever consume them both. He stopped pacing, his hand clenched around a silver locket he wore under his shirt. The metal was cold against his skin. He could not do it again. He could not be that man again. Damnation was a word for priests and poets. For him, there was only the cold, hard fact of action or inaction. The decision was not a thought. It was a physical release, a storm breaking inside him. In a single, fluid motion, he was moving. He grabbed his worn leather medical bag, its contents a familiar weight in his hand. He threw on his oilskin coat, the rain already soaking the shoulders as he wrenched the door open and plunged into the maelstrom. The world was a churning fury of wind and water, but his path was clear. He saddled his horse with frantic, practiced hands, the animal shifting nervously under the assault of the storm. He rode out of his sterile sanctuary, not toward salvation, but away from the one failure he could not bear to repeat. He found their camp nestled in a small, sheltered canyon, the flickering light of their fire a fragile beacon against the oppressive dark. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the mud, the medical bag a heavy, solid promise in his hand. Nita and her sisters emerged from the largest of the wickiups, their faces impassive masks in the firelight, betraying nothing of their surprise. Elias Thorne stood before them, dripping and resolute, the storm raging around him as if he had brought it with him. He met Nita's ancient eyes, and for the first time, he did not look away. "I will not accept your bargain," he said, his voice cutting through the roar of the wind, "but I will treat your mother." He held up his bag. "This is my price. You will do exactly as I say. You will answer my questions. You will give me your complete cooperation." He paused, letting the weight of his terms settle in the space between them. Nothing more, nothing less. Is that understood? The air inside the wickiup was a thick, humid blanket woven from the scents of pine, sweat, and sickness. The matriarch's breaths were a shallow, ragged rhythm, each one a struggle that seemed to scrape the life from her lungs. Elias Thorne worked with a grim, focused efficiency, his hands moving with the practiced grace of a man who found solace only in the mechanics of his trade. He had done everything his science dictated. He had cleared her lungs, administered what tinctures he had, and kept her fever from consuming her entirely. But it was like trying to bail out a sinking ship with a teaspoon. The matriarch was holding on, but she was not winning. "Her breathing is too strained," he said, more to himself than to Nita, who knelt silently by her mother's side, wiping her brow with a damp cloth. "The inflammation constricts the passages. If I could relax the muscles, give her lungs a chance to fight." He trailed off, the frustration a bitter taste in his mouth. He knew exactly what he needed, a small brown bottle sitting on a shelf miles away. Laudanum, a few drops would ease the worst of it. Nita's gaze lifted, her dark eyes locking onto his. There was no question in them, only a deep, unsettling understanding. He saw the path forward in that look, and he hated it. "Kane's trading post," he said, the name leaving his lips like a curse. "It's the only place." The journey was a tense, silent ride under a sun that baked the earth to a cracked, dusty canvas. Kane's post was a squat, ugly building of raw timber, the only sign of civilization for 100 miles. Inside, it smelled of dust, cured leather, and the cloying sweetness of cheap tobacco. Silas Kane stood behind the counter, a man whose smile never reached his cold, assessing eyes. He was polishing a shotgun with an oily rag, his movements slow and deliberate. "Well now, Dr. Thorne," Kane began, his voice a low, gravelly purr. "Didn't expect to see you so far from your little hermitage. I trust the territory is treating you well?" "I need laudanum," Elias said, dispensing with the pleasantries. He placed a few coins on the rough-hewn counter. Kane's eyes flickered to the coins, then back to Elias's face, a flicker of amusement in their depths. "Laudanum," he repeated as if tasting the word. "Powerful medicine, dangerous in the wrong hands." He set the shotgun down, his movements a study in casual authority. Heard you were spending your time out at the Apache camp, a man of your talents. It seems a waste. This territory needs a proper doctor, someone to look after the folks building a life out here, a company man. The unspoken offer hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Join me. Abandon them. I'm not looking for a position, Elias said, his voice tight. I'm looking to buy medicine. And I'm looking to build a community, Kane countered smoothly, leaning forward. A man has to choose a side, Doctor. Can't have a foot in two different worlds. It's just not stable. He pushed the coins back across the counter with a single manicured finger. I'm afraid my supply is reserved for my own people. I'm sure you understand. The refusal was absolute. Elias felt a cold fury rise within him, but he held it in check. Arguing would be a pointless exercise in powerlessness. He turned and walked out, the weight of his failure heavier than the sun on his shoulders. The ride back was grim. As they neared the canyon, Nita reined in her horse and dismounted. Elias watched, intrigued, as she moved with a quiet purpose into a thicket of scrub oak. Her hands, which he had only seen clenched in desperation or tending to her mother, moved with a new kind of certainty. She gathered a handful of pale, fuzzy leaves from one plant, stripped the bark from a thin willow branch with a small knife, and dug for a gnarled, dark root. She said nothing. Her actions spoke a language older than his books, a syntax of the earth itself. Back at the camp, she crushed the ingredients with a stone, her movements a silent ritual. She brewed them into a dark, fragrant tea. The steam carried a scent of bitter earth and faint mint. She held the cup to her mother's lips, murmuring soft words in her own tongue. Elias stood back, his medical knowledge feeling suddenly arrogant and incomplete. He was a man of science, a believer in the visible, the provable. But as he watched the matriarch drink, he saw the tension in her chest ease, her ragged breaths quieting into a slower, deeper rhythm. It was not a cure, but it was a reprieve. A victory won not with scalpels and chemicals, but with a knowledge he had been blind to. He looked at Nita, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a desperate girl, but as a woman of profound, hidden strength. They had just made a powerful enemy, but he was no longer fighting alone. Days bled into a week. The matriarch's condition reached a fragile plateau. She was no longer drowning, but she wasn't breathing freely either. The tea provided comfort, but the underlying sickness held its ground. The stalemate gnawed at Elias. His training screamed at him that he was missing a piece of the puzzle. Pneumonia was a brutal but straightforward adversary. This was different. This was stubborn, malignant. Driven by a restless need for answers, he began to examine their environment, their routine. The water was clean. The air was fresh. It was their food supply that drew his attention. A sack of flour, procured from Kane's post weeks ago, sat half empty near the fire. He took a handful, rubbing it between his fingers. The texture was right, the smell, mostly. But there was a faint, musty undertone he couldn't place. He spread a thin layer on a flat, dark stone, and then he saw it. Tiny, almost imperceptible specks of purplish black, like grains of dark sand, were mixed in with the white. His blood ran cold. It wasn't sand. He knew with a sudden sickening certainty what it was: ergot, a fungus that grew on rye but could contaminate other grains, a poison, a slow cumulative poison that caused convulsions, gangrene, and a suppression of the body's ability to fight infection. The pieces slammed together in his mind with the force of a physical blow, the stubbornness of the illness, the way it ebbed and flowed. Kane's refusal to sell him medicine, it wasn't an oversight, it was a strategy. This wasn't just a lung fever. This was a calculated, deliberate act of biological warfare. The revelation was so monstrous it stole the air from his lungs. He was not fighting a disease. He was fighting a man who would poison a family for a plot of land. The chilling implications settled over him like a shroud. Kane hadn't just refused to help them. He was actively trying to kill them all, and he would not stop until the job was done. The night air was still and cold when the world erupted in violence. The first sound was the thunder of hooves, followed by the splintering crack of a rifle shot that was not aimed at the sky. Men on horseback poured into the canyon, their faces illuminated in horrifying flashes of fire and shadow. Silas Kane's voice, amplified by rage, cut through the chaos. "Thorne, you're under arrest for theft. These savages are wanted for rustling." It was a lie, a flimsy pretext for a slaughter. Panic seized the camp. Elias shoved Nita and her sisters towards the back of the wickiup, his mind reeling. He had been so focused on the poison in the flower that he hadn't seen the poison in the man. He had underestimated Kane's ruthlessness. As he watched, one of Kane's men hurled a torch onto the roof of his own distant cabin, visible on the ridge. The dry timber caught with a hungry whoosh, flames clawing at the night sky. He watched it burn, his books, his instruments, his sterile, ordered sanctuary. It was all turning to ash, the physical manifestation of his self-imposed exile. The fortress he had built against his own heart was being consumed. And with it, any hope that he could contain this, that he could fix this. He had tried to redeem his past failure, and in doing so, had brought a fiery hell down upon the very people he had vowed to protect. The familiar, soul-crushing weight of his own inadequacy threatened to pull him under. All was lost. But then, through the smoke and the shouting, he saw Nita. She was not cowering. Her face was a mask of fierce calm. She grabbed his arm, her grip as strong as iron. "There is a way," she said, her voice low and steady, a point of absolute stillness in the whirling chaos. "A path through the rocks. He knows this camp. He does not know the land." She looked past the flames, past the terror, to the dark, silent mountains that cradled them. For the first time, Elias saw not a hostile wilderness, but a sanctuary. His world had burned down. Hers was just beginning. The cave was a womb of cold stone, a sanctuary deep in the heart of the mountain where the world could not find them. They had carried the matriarch on a makeshift litter, her body as fragile as a dried leaf, her breath a faint whisper in the profound silence. For days they had subsisted on what Nita and her sisters could forage, their resilience a quiet, unassailable fact. But their mother was fading. Elias saw it in the waxy pallor of her skin, felt it in the thready pulse beneath his fingers. He had run out of medicine, out of options. He was failing again. Huddled by a small, smokeless fire, the matriarch stirred. Her eyes, cloudy with fever, found Nita's. Her voice was a dry rustle of leaves. "The land weeps," she whispered, her hand moving to a small leather pouch at her belt. "He will not stop until he drinks its tears." With trembling fingers she drew out a piece of buckskin, folded and worn soft with time. She pressed it into Nita's hand. "This is why. This is the sickness in his heart." Nita held the pouch for a moment, then passed it to Elias. He unfolded the leather with a strange reverence. Inside, it was not a medicine pouch, it was a map. The lines were drawn in charcoal and berry juice, depicting the canyons and mesas with an intimacy that only generations of existence could produce. At the heart of their land, nestled in a narrow winding canyon, was a small, star-shaped mark. Beside it, a symbol Elias recognized from old prospectors' tales: silver. The final piece of the puzzle slid into place with the force of a physical shock. This wasn't about grazing rights or expansion. It was about greed. Raw, simple, and absolute. Kane's cruelty wasn't random. It was the cold, calculated logic of a man who saw human lives as nothing more than obstacles on a treasure map. And in that moment, Elias's intellectual arrogance, the last vestige of his old self, shattered. He had been trying to fight a disease with medicine, a fire with water. He saw now that he had been looking at the problem all wrong. He could not outfight Kane. He could not outrun him. He had to outthink him. He looked at the map, then at Nita. "This canyon," he said, his voice quiet but charged with a new energy. "You know it well?" Nita nodded, a single sharp movement. "It is the place of the sleeping serpent. The path is narrow. The rocks, they listen." "Good," Elias said, a predatory calm settling over him, "because we're not going to run from Silas Kane anymore." He looked at the faces of the four sisters, seeing not victims but warriors. "We're going to set a trap, and we're going to use the one thing he values more than life itself as the bait." The plan was a delicate, dangerous piece of clockwork. One of Kane's own men, a young rider with a gambling debt and a weak constitution, was the key. Nita's youngest sister, fleet-footed and silent, tracked him for a day, finally losing a small, hastily copied version of the map where he was sure to find it. They baited the hook. Now they could only wait and see if the fish would bite. They didn't wait long. Greed, Elias knew, was a more potent drug than any laudanum. From a high perch, they watched as Cain and a dozen armed men rode out from the trading post, their movements frantic, their eyes fixed on the promise of a silver-laced horizon. They were not a posse seeking justice. They were a pack of wolves catching the scent of blood. Cain led them directly toward the mouth of the canyon, the place of the sleeping serpent. The canyon was a tomb waiting for a body. The walls rose up, sheer and red, swallowing the light and the sound. Nita and her sisters moved through the high rocks like ghosts, their knowledge of the terrain an invisible weapon. They did not attack. They manipulated. A carefully started rockslide blocked the canyon mouth behind the riders, trapping them. A thrown stone sent a rider's horse into a panicked frenzy, creating chaos in the ranks. They were everywhere and nowhere, their presence felt but never seen, turning Cain's own men into a nervous, jittery wreck. Finally, at the narrowest point, Elias stepped out from behind a massive boulder, blocking the path. He was unarmed, his medical bag in his hand. "It's over, Cain," he said, his voice echoing in the tight space. Cain laughed, a raw, ugly sound. "Is it, Doctor? I see one man. I have 12 guns. The math doesn't look good for you." "Your men are not here for me," Elias said calmly, ignoring him and speaking directly to the posse. "He told you these people were rustlers. He told you I was a thief." He reached into his bag and pulled out the sack of tainted flour. With a sharp flick of his wrist, he tossed it onto a large, flat rock. It split open, spilling a cloud of white dust mixed with the telltale specks of purple-black poison. "He told you lies. He has been poisoning this family, killing them slowly, because he is too much of a coward to face them." The men stared at the flour, then at each other. The seed of doubt had been planted. Cain's authority, built on lies and intimidation, began to crumble. "He's the liar!" Cain bellowed, his face contorting with rage. "Shoot him!" No one moved. The spell was broken. They saw Cain not as a leader, but as a man who would poison women and children for money. In the suffocating silence of the canyon, his power evaporated. One by one, the riders turned their horses around, picking their way back towards the rockslide, leaving him utterly and completely alone. Elias looked at the man, a king suddenly without a kingdom, and felt nothing but a cold, clinical pity. Justice had been done, not with a bullet, but with the simple, undeniable weight of the truth. The immediate aftermath was quiet. The threat was gone. They returned to their ravaged camp to find the matriarch breathing easier, the fever finally broken, as if the land itself could begin to heal now that the poison had been excised. Elias stood on the ridge, looking at the charred remains of his cabin. The sterile fortress was gone. His books, his tools, his past all ash. He felt no grief. He felt only the clean, sharp sting of liberation. He was no longer a prisoner of his own memory. 6 months later, the scent of fresh-cut pine filled the air. Spring had come to the territory, breathing life back into the land. Where the ashes of his cabin had once been, a new structure was rising. It was larger, stronger, with the solid bones of a home and the clean, bright space of an infirmary built into its design. Elias was showing Nita's youngest sister how to properly clean and stitch a wound, his movements patient, his voice calm. A few feet away, Nita was grinding herbs with a stone pestle, showing him how the willow bark, when prepared just so, could soothe a fever as well as any powder in his lost bottles. The terrible bargain they had once tried to strike had been transformed into something new, a willing partnership built on a foundation of mutual respect. He looked at the new building, a place that merged two worlds, and at the family that had become his own. He finally understood. He had come to this wilderness seeking a quiet end, a place to let his ghosts bury him. Instead, he had found a new beginning. He realized his purpose was not to be a lone healer, fighting a solitary war against death. True healing was about building a life, a community, a sanctuary so strong that the world couldn't kill it. The legacy he thought he had lost forever was not a memory to be mourned, but a future to be built, right here, under the vast, forgiving sky.